All right, so good morning. My name is Annabelle Escamilla, and I am the Assistant Director for the Illinois Higher Education Center here at Eastern Illinois University. So today with us, we are really happy to have Ashleigh speak on sustainable prevention, why we are doing what we are doing, specifically with how that pertains to strategic planning for prevention. And so today we're going to have more of an interactive discussion. We're going to be looking at a broader view when it comes to success, what we think of success when it comes to prevention, and really just taking a kind of like that bird's eye view of what we can do to make sure that what we are doing outlasts, not just the week, the year, but planning ahead to make a greater impact. So I'm going to turn it over to Ashleigh, and then she can do a brief introduction.
Awesome. Thanks, Annabelle. Hi, folks. Happy to have you here. Really excited to talk about sustainable prevention strategies and to really overlay that with this concept of strategic planning, with particular attention to what framework for strategic planning makes sense to address substance use and misuse, right? So I'm going to introduce you to one framework today. There's many that we can consider, but I wanted to make sure that you were able to see a resource that I'll show you towards the latter end of this presentation. So I have a little bit of content that we're going to go over for sure. I want to make sure that, again, I introduce you to information that I think might be helpful. That being said, I'd love to leave some time at the end for questions, for maybe some shared learning together. Here's what we've done on our campus that's worked or not worked, and an ability to kind of share some space and create some mutual learning and knowledge exchange. So that's the goal. And in order to do that, let's jump right in. So this is me. I'm currently at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. I'm an associate dean there and the chief wellness officer. I have oversight for all of our health and wellness offices, which is inclusive of health services, our counseling center, health promotion and prevention, as well as the care team. And I've been working with the Higher Education Center for several years now, actually, just to help facilitate conversations in the field around this work. And so I'm super happy to be here and to be joining all of you today. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some short and long-term prevention strategies that are specifically designed for college students. So I'm literally going to give you lists of things that you can do, you can try, and there's particular focus on these lists for exactly what Annabelle said, not just having one program or 1 week that starts and ends and doesn't have further impact, but rather strategies that you can invest in that will have further impact for you beyond that one moment, that one interaction, right? So that's something to consider. Then we're going to look at a strategic planning framework. We're particularly going to look at one from SAMHSA, and I'm going to introduce you to that. I want to end and round out our conversation thinking about coalition building and collaboration, because one point that I want to make, and I'll make it now and I'll make it again, is that when we think about implementing a sustainable strategy for addressing substance use and misuse, if those of us working in health promotion, prevention, counseling, health and wellness writ large, if we are the only ones doing it, we're not going to succeed. And so we need to lean in on coalition building and collaboration in order for our efforts to be successful. So just reminding you of kind of our abstract and what we plan to do today. Really just goes over what I just talked about. So that's just kind of grounding us. And then our learning objectives really are what's going to bring us together. And we just went over those. So again, looking at some sustainable strategies, reviewing strategic planning, and talking for just a bit about coalition building and collaboration. So let's start by going over some strategies. So again, this is going to be a set of things to try. I'm certain that there are things that I'm going to share with you that you are already doing and doing really, really well. What I hope is that there might be some things that I can share with you that you haven't had experience with, or might be an interesting thing to try and add to your overall program. And so we'll go over some of that now. To ground us, though, I do want to sort of bring up an image that I've used with IHEC many, many times, but I use it in almost every presentation I do because I think it's important when we think about this work. And that this is the protractor from the Institute of Medicine, okay? And the way that this is designed is it shows us the very clear connection between the service-oriented work that we do, like going to a health services appointment or a counseling appointment, and it shows the connection between that sort of over the protractor to health promotion and prevention work, right? And so I want to just make it clear that these things are symbiotic, like they work together and they're all working towards the same goals, and they are connected. And so what you'll see here in the white sort of triangles are anything associated with treatment or recovery, which is certainly relevant to this conversation, right? Like, what are we offering as a strategy to address case identifications? That's going to be our diagnostics. Standard treatment for these issues. Compliance with long-term treatment. How are we supporting our students who need longer-term care? And then what does our recovery effort, what do our recovery efforts look like, right? Like all of that is significant, but then we get into the blue on the other side of the protractor. And this is where we really get our prevention strategies and health promotion strategies, right? So there's three kinds of prevention strategies. One is indicated. Those are usually with an individual person who's identified at higher risk. A great example of that would be basics, because a diagnosis has not yet been made, but an intervention strategy is deployed, and it is an indicated strategy. So that's one great example. Selective is for a group that might have higher risk of substance misuse. So student athletes, we have robust data that tells us that student athletes might be at higher risk for binge drinking, as an example. So how might we develop a selective prevention strategy that meets the specific needs of that group? And then universal is a strategy for the whole community, a strategy for everyone. Great example might be enforcing the drinking age, right? This is true for everyone, no matter who you are, no matter any sort of level of risk, it still applies. So those are the sort of three prevention strategies. And then we have this darker blue one, which is promotion. Now, the way I want you to think about this is prevention work is helping sort of negative things or less healthy things happen less, right? We want to decrease that harm. Health promotion is helping the good things happen more, the healthier things happen more, right? And that's totally oversimplified. But when we think about the difference, it does exist. And so when we think about health promotion efforts, it's how do we reinforce those protective factors? How do we do things like, a great example in this conversation is foster a really healthy social environment for our students that can exist with or without alcohol, as an example. So health promotion is just, again, that sort of overall pushing of those healthy or helpful behaviors. So this is one kind of frame that I want to introduce you to. And the next comes from a wonderful article on prevention groundwork from Nation, and it goes over, okay, so there are spaces and places where we have best practices articulated, and this is one of those areas, where we have different resources available to us, like the NIAAA as an example, when we think about like what is a valuable prevention effort. But what I love about this article from Nation is that it says, okay, so what if we don't? What if we're building something new? What if we are looking for a best practice and what we're finding doesn't fit our community and we're going to build something from scratch? What do we need to consider? And essentially, they give you this list of, I believe, 9 different sort of tenets that a prevention program, a successful prevention program would include. And so just to go over them briefly, the first is your prevention program comprehensive? So does it sort of meet multi-components of our students' lives that impact the behavior that we're talking about? The example here is, might it address things like family, peers, and community? So are we addressing, really thinking comprehensively, think about the social ecological model, like, right, how are we addressing sort of the multiple aspects of our students' experience on our campuses? Then there's the varied teaching methods. So as we know, people learn in different ways. And so when we think about a prevention effort, are we just putting out PowerPoints and doing presentations, or are we being more varied and more diverse in how we are implementing these strategies? And as I talk you through some strategy examples in a bit, you'll see some different ways that we can do that. Sufficient dosage. My greatest example for this one is how we like bombard our first year students with education and prevention and policy information. And then it kind of trickles away as they become older students in their sophomore, junior, or senior years. And so how do we provide what we call sufficient dosage across their experience, knowing that their experience is going to change? As an example, I worked at a college a few years back where we certainly addressed these issues with first year students, but we also knew that sophomore year was the most academically rigorous. And so there were higher levels of stress and things for us to consider about the sophomore year. We knew that the junior year, a lot of students went abroad. So there were concerns there around how they can navigate being sort of healthy as they travel. And then, there were certain and specific things around senior year, particularly around career development, internships, those types of things. There were different messages to share at different points of the student's career. And that's really what sufficient dosage is trying to get at. Theory driven is the next one. So there's got to be some kind of justification as to why we're doing what we're doing. That being said, I will say I'm also a huge fan of trying something brand new and being totally okay if you fail. I think that it's worth it. I think from a perspective of the impact it could have on students, I think in the perspective of the impact it could have on the field, to be able to say, hey, I tried this new thing, and here's what happened, right? And we'll talk about evaluation in just a moment, but in seriousness, when we think about particularly using our resources. So that could be our college or university funding or spaces, or maybe our peer educators, like, human resources. We want it to be tied and anchored to something. And being able to find some relevant theory is important to that. So theory driven is absolutely on the list. Positive relationships. So we know that when we do this work, when we implement prevention strategies within the confines of a healthy and positive relationship, whether that be the practitioner with the students that they're working with, the peer educators' relationship with the campus, the way that the dean of students sends out the community standards email, like all of those things exist within these relationships as well. And when those relationships are positive, the prevention effort is more likely to be successful. And so that's really important. And I want you to think about it almost like when we talk about therapy, right? We know that a therapeutic intervention is much more likely to be effective when there's a good and healthy relationship between the therapist and the client, where there's healthy rapport and there's sharing of trust and vulnerability. The intervention will work better. It's the same on a larger scale when we think about prevention efforts. Appropriately timed, this sort of goes with sufficient dosage a bit, but as an example to kind of walk you through what that might look like. So we, at a college I worked at prior, there used to be a tradition where for the last home football game, seniors would drink a fifth of alcohol between midnight and the start of kickoff. And it required us to have a specific intervention and prevention strategy for that one particular event. And so we had to be aware that that event existed and then time our efforts appropriately. And some of those strategies started months before that day, and some of them were that day specific. And so really thinking about how does our timing impact the work that we're doing. It needs to be socioculturally relevant. And so, what we know is that when we go back to, how the evidence might support what we're doing, we know that evidence is dominated by white, straight, cisgender people. And so, how do we ensure that what we're doing is actually going to be effective for the students that we serve? So that's critical. Evaluation, all I'll say about this is everything you do from a prevention and health promotion perspective should be assessed. And when we think about assessment in this sphere, those blue triangles on the protractor, we're looking at long game work, right? We know that when we implement a new effort, whether it be an environmental strategy or a community strategy or maybe a policy, those types of things, it takes years to see its true impact on the community. And so buckle down, it's gonna be an adventure, but the assessment is worth it to show the impact of the intervention itself. And then lastly, having well-trained staff. So do you have the people, and are they capable and able and supported to implement these prevention and intervention strategies? So a really, really great list. I use it all the time. It's super grounding when we think about wanting to do something new and making sure that it has all of these components in order for us to build something strategic. So I want to spend just a little bit of time giving you some ideas of what some strategies might look like. And again, I hope that there are some of these that you're like, oh yeah, we do that and we do that really well. I hope there are some of these where maybe you've tried it and it hasn't gone well, and we can talk about it towards the end of this time together. Or maybe some of them will be totally new for you, and that'd be awesome too. So we're going to start at those individual or indicated levels. So again, that's that level where a diagnosis has not yet been reached, but one particular person is identified at higher risk. So a couple of things that you can do. You can do what's called a PFI, a personalized feedback inventory. There's a couple ways you can do this. There are certain programs that allow you to build this in. And it's a brief survey that a student would fill out, and then it gives them immediate feedback. And you can do this through programs like the Basics First Light program, or you can build your own. PFIs are available. You can use whatever tools you have at your disposal, i.e. Qualtrics would be an example. And you basically create a survey that when the student hits finish, the survey is scored and the student is given relevant psychoeducation that is connected to the answers that they gave on the survey. What's great about this is it's immediate and it's educational, but it also doesn't take any staff time outside of the actual building of the function itself. This is something that a student would be able to do on their own. It's a great thing to link to a website, have on maybe iPads or screens, those types of things. Individual skills training. So this is going to be, what you might do in orientation or, other places where you're looking at things like BACs and drink pours and being able to build those individual skills. So that's definitely a component that we want in our overall prevention strategies. Again, basics, brief alcohol screening and intervention for college students, a 1 to 2 session intervention that is evidence-backed, theory-driven, and in my experience, incredibly useful and successful. If you have questions about implementing a basics program on your campus, please feel free to ask. It's a great strategy, particularly through partnership with your community standards or conduct offices. Universal screenings. So one thing that I would, definitely recommend is that in spaces where you see high student traffic, and I'm going to particularly recommend your health center, or even something like a fitness center, where you see a lot of students coming through, certainly more than you might see coming through a counseling center, perhaps. I want there to be information, educational information, or universal screenings available. And one of the reasons for this is that it, again, by nature of the screening itself, provides education. So there are ways that we can build questions, almost like we would a suicide prevention screening or the GAD-7 and anxiety screening or a Beck's depression screening. We can use something called the audit or the QDIT, one for alcohol, the QDIT is for cannabis, to be able to give students an immediate, here's your score and here's what that means. And what's awesome about implementing this in places where we have higher traffic is we have these little micro educational moments that are built into their experience. And so not only is it a successful individual strategy, but it also becomes normalized. So if you go to your health center and you do an audit screening or you do a suicide prevention screening or whatever, and you get a score back that concerns you, the likelihood that you're going to talk to that provider, that nurse practitioner, that doctor, whoever that is much higher because you've been educated in the moment just while waiting in the waiting room. It's a great tool to use. And then to think about recovery. I think that, this is one area that we are seeing a lot of growth in as far as what different college campuses are doing. And I think that, recovery programming needs to be right-sized for the institution. And there might be situations where it makes sense to partner with other institutions to offer resources that allow students to maybe not feel so isolated. Because it can be, there are colleges and universities where this is a really robust community, and there are colleges and universities where it's pretty small. And so you want to be able to offer what you can. The only thing that I'll say here is that, it can be valuable to offer something as an institution or with other institutions, because traditional recovery resources, like if we talk about AA as an example, sometimes what I've heard from students is that it doesn't really meet their needs. And so how can we build something that better meets their needs through through the systems that we already have available? So the next one is really thinking about community approaches. And so again, the selective strategies are for groups that are identified at higher risk. So a couple of things that can be really helpful. The first is access to food. This is absolutely a sustainable and strategic example of an intervention. So, you might be thinking about ways that students can have access to food in the late night hours between Thursday and Saturday, right? I know that actually at several colleges that I've worked at, the two big drinking nights were Thursday night and Saturday night. And so we made sure that there was food available. Now that looks like a couple different things. Like that looks like working with your dining provider to ensure that there's late night availability of something, whether it be sort of a small kind of store or market, or your dining hall actually being open. We also had things called party grants where students could apply for funding to have food at parties through our health and wellness office. So there could be a couple different ways to make that happen. You could also do work with your local, restaurants or food providers for things like coupons for students or promotions for students on high drinking or heavy drinking nights. Absolutely implementing social host training. So being able to identify who on campus is throwing parties, who on campuses, for lack of a better word, kind of controls the alcohol or substance use, and making sure that they know what to do to prevent sort of higher risk behaviors from happening. And so that's absolutely imperative. Have a plan around sporting events and tailgates. And this is a great way to partner with your athletics folks, right? And to really think about, how might we best manage those community events so that they are as safe and healthy as possible. And this is also a great inroad to work with athletes, because again, as I mentioned before, it is a higher risk population. And so if we are paying attention to the places and spaces where they exist, we actually have this wonderful opportunity to work with them in greater detail as well. Social norms work is another great strategic and sustainable practice. And really what we're looking at there is having a constant flow of data. And you can decide what this looks like for you. You can pull from an already existing, data tool like the NCHA as an example, or you can build your own. And the sort of beauty of social norms is that we're using data to tell a story that helps normalize the experiences of our community. One of my favorite examples is that usually when we do surveying of our students around their alcohol use, there is a much higher percentage of substance-free students than people would ever guess that there are, right? So if you were to ask a question, are you substance-free? And then how many others do you feel like are substance-free? There's going to be a big gap there. And what an educational opportunity that is, right? To be able to say, hey, to throw on a poster, I'm just going to make this up, but 30% of students are, consider themselves to be substance-free. Just by having that up and out there, it's affirming for students who are making that choice, but also it's an educational opportunity to say, this actually isn't what everybody does, and that's okay. And then there's plenty of other ways that you can use data to continue to tell stories about use or non-use or recovery or any of those types of things. So really, really great tool to have at your disposal. Bystander intervention, I think is a wonderful strategy. What I love about bystander work is it's multidimensional. And so, it's something that we often see come up in our sexual violence work, in our, mental health first aid type work, right? And so it is a strategy that can actually be kind of 30,000 foot brought out to address many different things, not just substance use, but you can sort of bring that into the fold, considering a larger bystander intervention strategy. Again, substance-free programming options, so making sure that, particularly on those higher risk nights, those Thursdays, those Saturdays for me when I was at another college, making sure that there are substance-free options for students so they don't feel like that's where all of the socialization is happening. And I talked about party grants a little bit. And then the other one that I've had success with is almost like I talked about, the sort of the coupons with food access. You can also have some partnerships with things like ride shares. And so this would be a strategy to decrease the likelihood of drunk driving, as an example. So offering, ways that students can access ride shares like Uber or Lyft at a cheaper cost or at no cost to them. So just another example of a partnership that helps you create something sustainable. My favorite one probably on this list is partnering with parents and families. I think that parents and families, or sponsors otherwise, are our greatest, or one of our greatest assets in this work. We want the same things, and our students, families, parents, sponsors, whoever's in their lives, research tells us that that person's opinion about a certain subject is really important to the student. And so being able to build a partnership where we're providing mutual education and knowledge exchange, where we're supporting one another, where we're speaking the same nomenclature for our students, right? All of that really matters. And so when there are times and spaces to be able to connect with parents and families, I absolutely encourage you to do it. The way that I frame this when I talk to parents and families and sponsors at my current institution is I do a little talk on what I call sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Like we talk about the things that are difficult to sometimes talk about. And I also make a point that your students, as sort of crunchy and uncomfortable as they might feel, as they might look, they actually want to hear from you. They really do. And then they'll sort of follow up with us. So just a great place to go. Community policing, make sure that you're working with your public safety or police folks. And so, as an example, when we think about this as a community strategy, it's not just about how a uniformed officer responds to an alcohol incident or infraction, right? It's about students having the perception of two things. One, that they're safe. So a great way to think about that is, having cameras visible on campus, having, police cars driving around campus throughout the day. So people feel the presence of safety professionals. But the other is that these folks that they're seeing and that are noticing are approachable, and that their role on a college campus is what all of our roles are on a college campus, which is to be an educator. Right. And that's where this concept of community policing really comes in, is thinking about how are these folks, certainly there for crime, absolutely, but how are they providing education to our students in very similar ways as those of us in, AOD work or wellness or health work are doing as well. Have a drug disposal program or a needle exchange program, absolutely critical. You can usually work with your health services to do that. Screening days. So think about that PFI that I talked to you about at the individual level and doing that 100, 200, 300, 400 times in one day. That's where the impact of screening days really shows up. And then we have just a few more strategies when we think about really 30,000 foot zooming this out into the environmental or universal. So things that you can do with everybody in your community. I talked about enforcing the drinking age, hugely important. And lots of different ways to do that, lots of different perspectives that you can take around doing that, both from a community standards perspective, university police perspective, also how you engage with the community around you, right? So that's an easy one. Thinking about any hours of alcohol sales. So if you do have alcohol being sold on campus, think about, just be kind of thoughtful about the distribution there. When is alcohol sold? How much alcohol can be sold? How is it managed? Things like wristbands and those types of things, and making sure, again, that food is available. Yearly review of AOD policy. And so, I mean, we'll talk about collaboration at the end, but to have a team of folks who are invested in this work come together every year, including students, and provide feedback on the policies that impact the behaviors we see on campus, hugely important. Those policies should include amnesty. Or Good Samaritan policy, as it's sometimes known. And that should be available to individuals as well as organizations. So, if one person makes a call because they believe that somebody might, at the party, might have alcohol poisoning, that one person can be covered by this amnesty policy, but maybe so can the organization. So maybe it's a team or it's a fraternity or sorority or something like that. There can be coverage there as well, and making sure that that's clear. And again, we've talked about some partnerships with local folks in the community and ways that we can, create sort of a robust and seamless experience for our students, both on and off campus. Having those substance-free initiatives and having them readily available and marketed. This is a big one, and it's one that I've had trouble with on campuses, quite honestly. But when you can, advocate for classes on Friday. It is a unique and can be a productive prevention effort to be able to, have students have somewhere to be and something to do on Fridays. And yet I do understand the sort of organizational challenges of that, but it can be actually really productive to have that conversation with your academic colleagues and partners at your institutions. When we think about just talk about types and amounts of alcohol permitted. Fairly new, talk about alcohol delivery. What's happening at your institution around the various sort of delivery companies that provide alcohol. A conversation that often comes up with this is IDs and fake IDs, and how does that impact our policy? And so just having that on your radar, I think, is smart. We'll talk more about coalitions, but consider a multi-disciplinary coalition that addresses this work. One thing that I have sort of preached my whole career is that whenever we're thinking about sustainable and strategic initiatives within the sort of perspective of health and wellness work, if the health and wellness people are the only ones doing it, we're going to fail 100%. And so you need a multidisciplinary team to say, how are we going to come together and all do this work on the same page to make sure that the student experience is, again, seamless? So just something to consider. Okay, so I want to just introduce you to a framework, and I won't spend too much time here, but I want to make sure you know about it, because I think that it's incredibly effective, it's comprehensive, and I think it gives you a great start in regards to providing a direction for what a strategic planning framework for alcohol and drug use might look like. So really what we're going to lean into here is the SAMHSA framework. And you'll see here just an image that encompasses the 5 areas that it asks you to address. And we'll go into each one in just a little bit of depth. So, the one thing that the framework does, I think, really well is it talks about the correlation and the connection between these 2 ideas, importance and changeability. And what I love about it is it tries to and strives to encourage and challenge us to move towards high importance and high changeability through making sort of thinking about those decisions, going back to those 9 points from Nation, right? And being able to build something that is going to be really impactful for our communities. And so this is just a piece of the framework that I just find really helpful to think about. Okay, this thing that we're building, this choice that we're making, this initiative that we're implementing, is it of high importance and high changeability? And that's a goal. So the strategic framework includes 5 steps, like I said: assessment, capacity, planning, implementation, and evaluation. And I'll leave this slide up for just a minute so that those who are watching the recording can take a read. But really what it's doing is the following. The assessment piece: what's the problem, right? What are we trying to address? Capacity: what do we have to work with? What resources are available to us in the moment? Planning. What should you do and how should you do it, right? Going back to some of our previous conversations. Implementation. How can we put that plan into action? And then evaluation, is your plan succeeding? And quite honestly, if we can ask ourselves those 5 questions and answer those 5 questions confidently, strategically, we're going to be in really good shape. And then there's also these 2 other pieces that the framework includes that are really, really important. One is cultural competency. And so making sure that like it's almost an overlay, right, of those 5 pieces that you saw. Cultural competency and this concept of sustainability needs to be blanketed across all 5 of those things. And so you'll see a little bit here as to what the framework means by those definitions. But I think it probably makes pretty good sense to say, okay, as we're answering these 5 questions that you saw on this slide, are we looking at issues of cultural competency and sustainability when we make those, when we articulate those answers, right? And so just know that the prevention framework itself acknowledges that and challenges us to ask ourselves those questions. So that is also articulated in the framework. So what makes this different than other frameworks? So a couple of things. One is that it's dynamic and it's iterative. So it's intended to be moving in multiple spaces and places at once. And so you can have a lot of different initiatives happening at one time. And it, in particular, does not promote sort of a linear strategy forward. It's much more dynamic and complex than that. It's more moving in a sort of a circular way than it is a linear way, constantly going back to those 5 questions. It's data driven. So because of the 2 components, one being that initial assessment in the beginning and how we define the problem, and then the bookend evaluation around how we know if we've been successful. Really what's lovely is it creates this start and end of the process, which obviously should be totally infused in the whole middle, but it really grounds us in the work in in those bookend pieces. And then it relies on a team approach. Like I said, we can't do this work in a silo. Our impact is going to be significantly different if we do this work alone. And so when we think about sustainable strategic, we'd think about collaboration. So just want to review the steps here. I won't spend too much time here, but I want to just introduce you to how they break these down. So there's 3 steps in the first category here, which is assessment. So what we're looking at is assessing the problem and related behaviors, prioritizing those. And so there's some different ways that we can do that. And then assessing for risk and protective factors. So when we think about sort of that overlay that we talked about, there are a couple of things that we need to do in addition to these 3 steps. And while we're doing these 3 steps, the first is looking at subpopulations, right? So this is a great opportunity to disaggregate your data. Don't always just look at, from a data perspective, what the typical student at your campus might experience or how they might behave. Look at subpopulations and be able to break your data down and see maybe who might be at higher risk than others, because then you can lean into those selective prevention strategies that we talked about earlier. Identify data gaps. So sometimes you might say, I really want to know about, as an example, this subpopulation, and you have no way of knowing about them. And so identify gaps, take efforts to fill them. Think about how you're going to use subpopulations to inform how you build a data strategy, and also sharing with them the results. We talked a little bit earlier about this idea of doing prevention work within the concept of healthy relationships, of positive relationships, right? And part of what I mentioned there was trust. And this is a way to build trust, is to say, hey, like, we're going to ask you, whatever the subpopulation is, maybe trans and gender nonconforming students, we're going to ask you about your specific experiences, and we're going to come back and share with you what we learned. That's a huge step that I think is significant in the promoting of vulnerability and trust when it comes to data collection on our campuses. And then the last piece is just being prepared to make decisions based on the data that you have. So capacity, and I think this is the tough one. I really do. I think that we actually, have playbooks around, what we know works or doesn't, or is worth implementing or not. I think that in the AOD sphere, we've been able to build a lot of that, but the question becomes, do we actually have the resources to get this done? And this is where that piece around partnership is particularly important, because, I can't tell you the last time I talked to a colleague who said, "Oh yeah, we're totally appropriately staffed. Like we have exactly what we need." That's not usually the narrative. And so thinking about community stakeholders, developing a team, and then raising community awareness are going to be three critical steps here. And then, looking again at that overlay of cultural competency and sustainability, you'll see some examples here. And so really preparing, a lot of these are about preparing your community members to be good stewards of this information. How do you educate your community so that they're all kind of doing a little bit of this work with you, and making sure that they understand, basics around AOD work, but also that they have the ability to navigate your campus resources or your community resources, as an example. You want to make sure that these relationships that you're building are across all levels of the institution, so that different constituents can have places and spaces to go. And so just as you might want, your res life staff who is sort of on the ground with students to have a certain awareness of these issues, you want your dean of faculty to as well, because these issues are going to show up in different ways in different places. The other piece is that we want to make sure that this capacity that we do build is nimble. We know that sometimes this work changes, sometimes the wind blows, and there's a new thing to address. I remember being at a campus, several years ago now, and this concept of microdosing came up, and it was like, oh, and we need to pivot, and it was new. Or in the past couple of years, boards, came up, and it was like, okay, like we need to pivot a little bit, and how do we use the capacity that we built, the humans, the money, the space, the time, to make sure that we can meet those needs and make that happen. So the planning is, what do we do? What do we do about it, right? So prioritizing those risk and protective factors, again, going prevention, promotion, right? Risk, protective, same deal. Selecting our interventions, and then developing a plan that aligns with a logic model. So really just being intentional about the work. Again, think collaboration. Who is engaged in this planning process? Who would we choose as partners? Could it depend on the populations we're trying to impact? Do we want decision makers in the room? Are we socioculturally relevant? Do we have folks in the room who represent multiple and different communities on our campus, not just a sort of a singular narrative? You should definitely utilize logic models. There's some great trainings out there. ACHA has a great one, great introductory training on how to build and utilize a logic model if you haven't yet done that in your work. And then the last piece is really being communicative, and being communicative with purpose. And so, making sure that if you take on sort of a planning group, that you've got a plan for how you're going to communicate with each other, that also fits into that capacity conversation, right? Like, what's it going to take for you, probably as the leader of this effort, to make this effort flourish? And communication is a significant part of that. So the implementation is, all right, we have a plan now. Now, how do we do it, right? And so delivering programs, balancing fidelity with adaptation, retaining those core components. So again, that's sort of that theory-driven stuff. And then implementation, supports, and monitoring. And so again, that overlay of cultural competency and sustainability, looking at ways that we want to address disparity is absolutely important. Doing things with people rather than to them or for them is significant, again, within the building of those positive relationships. Thinking about ways that students or other community members can opt in to the work, right? And, we know, again, I'll talk about therapy for a second. We know that therapy is much more successful when somebody comes in a self-determined way, meaning that they are choosing to, as opposed to maybe a mandated session, right? We just know that we're probably going to have better luck from an intervention perspective in that regard. And then, making sure that what evidence-based practices we're using allow us to be both culturally competent and sustainable. And the last bookend here is evaluation. So how do we know if we did this well? And again, when we're thinking about promotion or prevention, it's long game stuff. So it's not just, your post-test right after the event, right? It's got to be longer game. And you'll see that a little bit here. So really thinking about your process, how you're going to get information from multiple constituents and multiple different identities on your campus. Being really thoughtful about adaptation. So when the program you do changes, and it will, you'll learn, you'll tweak, you'll learn, you'll tweak. How do we make sure that the assessment process and evaluation process accounts for those changes? Making sure that you have a process that is community oriented. And so being able to engage with the people that you'll be evaluating, whose narratives that you'll be sharing, and having them be a part of that process. And then having a really solid plan on how you're going to share your findings with the community. This actually goes back to that social norms piece around how do we share our data? What are some cool ways that we can use our data to educate? This would be a great example. So just to close us out today, I just want to talk for a second about collaboration. And again, I've hinted at this already. If we do this alone, the likelihood of us being successful is pretty slim. And so I think that having some kind of collaborative approach is probably going to be the way that we hit these two things that we're here to talk about today. Something that is truly strategic and something that is truly sustainable. And getting other people involved, and not only that, but like making it very clear that this work is central to the success of what they do, right? That's the golden ticket of all of this. And so there's lots of different ways that we can collaborate. What you'll see here is a spectrum that I really like from Tamarack, and they're one of the leaders in like collective impact work, if you're familiar there. And it just sort of shows just some different ways that people and groups can interact with each other. And you can find your sweet spot, right? There's no necessarily right or wrong here, but there are different ways that we can approach what would this actually look like? And what type of collaboration do we need? Where on this continuum do we fall for us to be successful in our efforts? So just something for you to consider. So just a couple of closing and final takeaways, kind of what I would hope that you would leave this session with today, is that I want you to have a balance with a variety of prevention efforts, including those short and long-term efforts at the micro, meso, and macro levels. So micro being individual, meso being group, macro being population. I want you to engage in an explicit strategic framework. I introduced you to SAMHSA today. No obligation to use that one. I happen to like that one. I want to make sure that people in our field know that that exists. If you have another one, use it, but be consistent and be intentional about that use. And again, we can't do this work alone. Find your champions, your partners, and your co-conspirators early, and always keep your ear open for new folks and find them often. So that is sort of what I have for you today. I've got about 10 minutes left for anything that's come up for folks. My contact information is here. Please reach out if there's anything that you need, if there's any way I can be helpful to you. I love connecting with folks and just brainstorming and talking about the ways that we can enhance our work. And so please feel free to reach out if that would be helpful for you. So I'm going to stop my screen share and see if there's anything that I can help people with today. Or Annabelle, if there's anything that you'd like to share.
Yeah, just thank you for that time and all of that wonderful information. I always like your spin on how you talk about different resources and why it matters. So I was going to say, we've got a variety of folks with us today. I know that work throughout the state in different capacities. So I'm hoping that they will take this information back to their institutions and find some kind of, little piece that they can share with their other colleagues. Are there any questions or comments that anybody would like to say unmute, drop in the chat? Please feel free to do so.
Any specific thoughts on implementing at a community college environment? Yes. I think that what would be a really cool way to think about this on at a community college level is we need to think about the environments that our students inhabit, right? So sometimes at a residential college, I like to call it like we make our own little mini cities, like, where all of the services that a person would normally need in their community, we offer as a campus. And so that, there's the campus doctor, there's the campus dining hall, there's the gym, like, and these are things that if you don't live on a residential campus, you go and find for yourself. And so my recommendation would be figure out what spaces your students inhabit, what restaurants do they go to, where does substance use exist? Are there local bars that are really popular with your students? Where do they spend time engaging in healthier behaviors? So gyms, who are the local doctors that are seeing, who are the PCPs that a lot of your students are going to? And I would build a community coalition to say, okay, this community college is one place where our students stop and engage, but they are out in the world. And so how do we bring relevant people together to say, we need a shared goal and approach for these students who attend this institution to be as healthy and safe as possible. And so I actually think it's a really cool opportunity to do some like citywide, cross professional work that will most significantly impact students who are in a community college environment. I think that's super cool. I think that's an awesome opportunity. Looking at recovery, yes. So there's actually a campus recovery conference. I don't know when the next one is, but it's usually a couple of days where recovery professionals come together, or people who are interested in starting collegiate recovery programs are able to go. I know that a few years ago it was at Boston University, and I'm in Massachusetts, so that was close to me, but there is a professional like organization of folks that do that work together. And so if you get in contact with them, they can, you have resources right there for you as far as different things you might consider, like building a space, or usually there's some sort of bylaws or something within a recovery community, and you wouldn't be the first one doing it. So I'd want to make sure you were hooked up with a community like that. Oh, thank you, Annabelle. That's in the chat, Liz, as well.
I think they go to NASPA and stuff too. I mean, they have little tables and booths, so if you ever go to any of those events, they should have things set up.
Yeah, for sure, with strategies coming up in January.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Any other questions? But I'm not seeing anything at the moment.
All
So
right.
just kind of prepare to wrap up here. So thank you all to those that did attend today. So if you have questions, please feel free to email me and I can forward you to Ashleigh, vice versa. I will be sending out what do you call it? An evaluation form for the webinar if you are needing CEU credits for today. Will you be sending me the slide deck?
Sure.
Okay, I can post that as well. Just some people do like to take notes on that as well.
Yep.
So all of those will be available, and I'm happy to share resources that Ashleigh mentioned earlier, because we typically have those ready to send out or mail out. So once again, thank you for attending, and thank you, Ashleigh, for your time and sharing your thoughts on the topic. So we greatly appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Have a good day, everybody.